The Biddeford Climate Task Force is an ad hoc group that reports directly to the mayor. We are a group of Biddeford residents who are passionate about addressing climate change at the local level. The task force has created a series of 3 videos highlighting the most important aspects of climate change. The first video contains information about how the state of Maine is experiencing climate change, especially in the context of our everyday lives. The second video in this series explains the ways in which climate change has given us the opportunity to seek solutions that allow both the natural world and human society to thrive. The final video of this series describes the work of the Biddeford Climate Task Force and how that group will help guide Biddeford through the period of transition that lies ahead. The science is clear. Our planet is warming and human activities are the cause. Virtually all aspects of modern life, from heating and cooling our homes, to transporting ourselves and goods around town or around the world, to producing the food we eat, produce greenhouse gases through the burning of coal, oil, and natural gas. Overwhelming scientific evidence shows that rising levels of greenhouse gases, such as carbon dioxide and methane, are disrupting Earth's delicate energy balance and trapping excess heat at the global level. Earth's surface has warmed by nearly 2 degrees Fahrenheit since the late 1800s. While this might not sound like a lot, this change has serious implications for the well-being of human societies and our natural environment. With such far-reaching impacts, climate change is the single most existential issue of our time. Importantly, the effects of climate change are not distributed equally around the globe. Impacts will look and feel different depending on where you live. For example, in Maine, things are warming faster than at the global level. Our state average temperature is now 3.2 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than it was in 1895. Not surprisingly, Maine is already experiencing a range of significant impacts due to climate change. So, what will these impacts mean for Mainers? To answer this question, I am here with Dr. Megan Daly, a climate change expert and member of the Biddeford Climate Task Force. Dr. Daly has held positions at the University of New England, the University of Leeds in the UK, and the Center for International Climate and Environmental Research in Oslo, Norway. Her research examines how communities can better prepare for the impacts of climate change across the U.S., as well as in Africa, Asia, and Europe. Now, as a current resident in Biddeford, she is working on addressing the local impacts of climate change in Maine. We are happy to have her here today. To answer this question, I sat down with Dr. Megan Daly, a climate change expert and member of the Biddeford Climate Task Force. Dr. Daly has held positions at the University of New England, the University of Leeds in the UK, and the Center for International Climate and Environmental Research in Oslo, Norway. Her research examines how communities can better prepare for the impacts of climate change across the U.S., as well as in Africa, Asia, and Europe. Now, as a current resident of Biddeford, she is working on addressing the local impacts of climate change in Maine. We are happy to have her here today. As I just mentioned, we know that globally the planet has already warmed about 2 degrees Fahrenheit. To most people, that probably doesn't seem like a big deal. Can you explain why this amount of warming matters?
Yeah, that's a really great question, Nicole. Most of us are used to having temperatures go up and down on a daily basis, particularly for anybody who lives here in New England. We know that very intimately. The important thing to remember is that we're talking about a change in the globally average temperature over many years. And typically, that fluctuates very little from year to year. So a change of 2 degrees over the last 150 years, which is what we've observed, is really unusual. And when we're talking about a change in the globally average temperature, as you mentioned, we're talking about heat that's trapped in our Earth system and more energy in our Earth system. And that energy can have an impact on our water cycle, the hydrologic cycle. So water is evaporating more quickly, the atmosphere holds more water, and that can really shift how we receive precipitation. And some places will get wetter, some places will get drier. We're already seeing this play out in the United States. The southwestern portion of our country is already experiencing drying, and here in the Northeast, things are getting wetter. We can talk a little bit more about that. But the important thing to remember is that the impacts will not be felt in the same way in all locations. And as you noted, at the closer you get to the poles, the more warming will be experienced. So that's why here in Maine, we're warming faster than the global average.
Okay, thank you. So now we know that global changes in temperature can have cascading effects throughout our environment. Can you describe some of the most important impacts that we're seeing in Maine?
Yeah, so here in Maine, we are experiencing a lot of impacts, and we would be here all day if we tried to talk about all of them. So I'll focus on three big ones that will have some serious consequences here in Maine. The first is sea level rise. The second is warming waters in the Gulf of Maine. And the third, changes in extreme weather and seasonality. So let's start with sea level rise. Here in southern Maine, we've already seen about 8 inches of sea level rise.
Wow.
And we're expecting to see, even under a middle of the road scenario in terms of our future warming, we're likely to see 1.5 feet of sea level rise by the mid-century and 4 feet by the end of the century. And importantly, over the last 15 years, the rate at which sea levels are rising is increasing. So we have a lot of work to do to try to manage the impacts of those rising sea levels. The second is looking at warming waters in the Gulf of Maine. The Gulf of Maine has warmed approximately 1 degree per decade over the last 30 years. Okay. And that is 3 times faster than oceans at the global level are warming. And, you know, we talk about the rate of change in the Gulf of Maine because it can have really important consequences on the biology of individual species and ripple effects through the entire food web. So, for example, in the Gulf of Maine, one of the key species is this tiny little crustacean called Calanus finmarchius, and it's about the size of a grain of rice. And it's a really key source of food for some of our iconic species, including cod and herring and lobster. Okay. And as the waters warm, the abundance of that food source has decreased by approximately 70%. So that's going to have really important consequences for the entire food web and the entire ocean system in the Gulf of Maine. And the last impact that I think it's important to talk about are changes in extreme weather and seasonality. So here in Maine, as I mentioned before, we are seeing wetter conditions. So we have now 6 inches more rainfall per year than we used to in the past. Now, an important feature of that is that that increase in rainfall is largely due to more heavy rainfall events. So storms where we get 1 or 2 inches of rain in a single event. Yep. Those have been increasing. And even though they're somewhat less frequent, we're also seeing an increase in 3 and 4 inch rainfall events. Those have increased threefold in Maine. And so you can imagine that has really important implications for our infrastructure, or even things like, will my basement be flooding with this upcoming storm? We've also seen a change in the seasons. So winters in Maine are becoming milder and shorter. We talked about how Maine has warmed 3.2 degrees across all seasons, but our winters are warming even faster than the average across all seasons. Our winters have warmed by 5 degrees. And so that means that a lot more of our precipitation is coming as rainfall rather than as snow, and all of the implications that that entails.
Yeah, I've definitely experienced that winter warming just in my lifetime as a skier in the winter. So seen that firsthand. I'm sure many people have as well. How will changes in climate affect the everyday lives of Mainers and specifically residents in Biddeford?
So with regard to warming in the Gulf of Maine, that will also have an impact on Mainers' everyday lives. So we talked a little bit about some of the species change that we're seeing. With regard to one of the most important species here in Maine, lobster, we know that lobster have already moved more than 100 miles north. The center of the lobster fishery has moved 100 miles north. And for the meantime, that's actually been kind of a great thing for Maine. We've had a relative boom in our lobster fishery. But the question is, how long will that last? If we don't take action to limit the warming that's happening in the Gulf of Maine, we may experience some difficulties. And we can look to some of our neighboring states to the south, where we know that the lobster fishery in Connecticut and Rhode Island and Long Island has already collapsed as the lobsters move further north in search of those cold waters where they are happiest.
Yeah.
And then finally, with regard to the extreme weather and changes in seasonality, that will have a lot of impacts on, for example, winter recreation, like you mentioned. If winters are shorter, we're already seeing that ice on our lakes and rivers is melting 2 weeks earlier.
Yeah.
So people won't be able to engage in those activities for as long, and it poses some safety issues, right? Times of the year when the ice might have been safe is no longer safe. And so these are just some of the examples of how people in their everyday lives might be impacted.
Wow, thank you. So there's a lot of things that will impact our everyday lives going forward. Are there some less obvious climate change impacts that people might not think about, or at least ones that people might not connect as a climate issue? Do you have any examples?
Yeah, I think one that comes to mind for us here in Maine, we enjoy a relatively cool climate. So we might not think about heat waves as a major problem.
Right.
But we are seeing an increase in extreme heat days. These are days where the heat index is over 95 degrees. And the number of those days of extreme heat are expected to triple by mid-century under our current conditions of warming, on our current trajectory. And for a lot of people, you might just think that this is an inconvenience or it's simply uncomfortable, but in Maine, only approximately 50% of our households have access to air conditioning. That's compared to 90% at the national level. Wow. So a lot of people don't have access to cooling. So on those really warm days, it actually poses health risks. Heat waves and extreme heat are the most lethal disasters we have here in the United States, and that's playing out here in Maine. On those days when we have extreme heat, there are a 10% increase in both emergency room visits and deaths. So it's having an effect on people's health, and that might surprise some people. Another example are shifts in species ranges of some of our terrestrial species. We've talked a lot about how that's playing out in our oceans. One that people might have already observed in their day-to-day life but might not know is connected to climate change is the abundance of deer ticks. For most people who grew up here in Maine who are older than 40, they didn't experience ticks in their day-to-day lives. They just weren't around. But again, with these shorter, warmer winters, the range of deer ticks has expanded northward. And now Maine is one of the states with the highest prevalence of Lyme disease and all of the impacts that on people's well-being and the health system that go along with that. And a more positive shift that we have observed is eastern bluebirds. And again, the shift of any species is due to a mosaic of factors, but we know that the northward migration of the edge of overwintering populations of bluebirds, that's in large part due to climate change. Yep. And a lot of people might really enjoy seeing a bluebird outside of their window during a gloomy January day in Maine. So you might not think it's necessarily a bad thing, but it really is a sign that not all is right with our climate and we are experiencing some significant changes.
Wow, thank you. Those are really insightful examples. Next question I have for you, kind of switching gears. Will all Mainers be equally affected by climate change? If not, can you explain why this is the cause?
Yeah, so unfortunately, some Mainers will be affected more than others, and that's largely due to three different pieces of the puzzle, as it were. The first is the kinds of climate impacts that you're exposed to. The second is how sensitive your livelihood or economy is to those kinds of climate impacts. And the third is your capacity to adjust. You know, what resources do you have available to you to make adjustments to better cope with those climate impacts? So here in Biddeford, we're a coastal community, but we also are located along the Saco River. We have an urban core located along that river. We also have inland forests and wetlands, and all of those shape our exposure to climate impacts.
Yep.
The second piece, in terms of how sensitive we are, for example, our economy here in Biddeford depends quite a lot on tourism. So you can imagine in scenarios where we have increasing sea level rise, less sand beaches could translate into less visits to our ocean front and fewer hotel visits, fewer visits to restaurant. It cascades through the economy. So we do have some sensitivity to those particular climate impacts. And then the third piece, that capacity to respond, is really, really important. So there are a lot of folks, for example, going back to that heat wave example, a lot of people may not be able to afford purchasing an air conditioner or running it, right? The expense of running it on a day-to-day basis. And that might be an impediment. So they're very susceptible to those impacts and they have little capacity to adjust. In contrast, you might think about some people who live along the coast, and they may have access to greater financial resources to make adjustments to their home, perhaps raising it up so that it's not as susceptible to flooding, or even relocating altogether. So there really are differences in across individuals, across groups, across neighborhoods within Biddeford. Not everybody will be affected in the same way.
And even like Biddeford will be affected differently than other cities around the state as well.
Absolutely.
So, wow, thank you. So this is certainly a lot of information. and it's clear that climate change is a serious problem. How can people avoid feeling overwhelmed? Do you have any ideas about how people can take action?
Yeah, so that's a really great question, and there is so much that can be done to start to address climate change. First and foremost, we have to get warming under control, and the best way to do that is through reducing our emissions.
Yep.
And so we can certainly take individual action, whether that is walking or riding a bike instead of driving. But we also know that this problem is much bigger than an individual can solve alone. We need to work together. We need solutions where we work together collectively to bring about some systemic changes. So things like modernizing our electrical grid, or shifting our energy production to renewable sources, things like that. Creating a public transport system that is efficient and easy to use. Those are things that is beyond what an individual can accomplish on their own.
Right.
First and foremost, one of the most important things that people can do is to talk about climate change. So talk to your friends, your family, your neighbors, your colleagues, because having those honest and important conversations with people that they know and trust is one of the best ways to raise awareness. The other piece is that we really need to communicate with our elected leaders that this is an important issue for us, and whether that's through writing letters, attending demonstrations, or simply voting for people who will make climate change a priority. So that's another really big piece. And then finally, of course, those individual actions, whether it's, again, can you take one less trip in your car next week? Can you buy food from local and sustainable farms? Those kinds of actions all add up and they all count. So we need to be doing all of those things.
Awesome.
And I would say that one thing that's really encouraging is that the state of Maine is already doing quite a lot on climate change. They've set an ambitious target for reducing our greenhouse gas emissions by 80% by 2050. Mm-hmm. And in order to accomplish that, they released a comprehensive climate action plan in 2020. And we're already seeing the implementation of that plan translating to support for cities and towns across Maine, including Biddeford, to implement climate action at the local level. So good things are already happening there. Here in Biddeford, we've already taken some exciting steps. So just a few weeks ago, we had some new chargers for electric vehicles installed. Through some rebates with Efficiency Maine, we were able to purchase several electric vehicles for the city's fleets.
Awesome.
We've also made some adjustments to Mile Stretch Road to be better prepared for sea level rise. And the schools are also entering in contracts to have renewable solar energy. So lots of exciting things are already happening. And I think it's clear that there's just so much more that needs to be done,
yeah.
But we've already started the ball rolling and we just need to keep pushing it forward.
That's great news. Like, we already have the momentum, so we just need to keep this going, and it's not as an overwhelming issue as it may seem.
Right.
All right, thank you for talking with me today.
Thank you.
Even as someone who is studying this exact subject in college, I often get the feeling of helplessness for this wide-reaching issue. However, I was able to combat these negative feelings by contributing to local solutions. As a part of the Biddeford Climate Task Force, I've noticed my feelings of despair shift to hope and excitement for the future. Climate change is caused by so many of our activities, but on the flip side, This also means that there are so many opportunities to take action. For this exact reason, we really do need all hands on deck when it comes to climate action. Additionally, unique perspectives and contributions will be invaluable. On that note, keep your eye out for the next segments of this series, climate change solutions and ways to get involved. In the meantime, stay connected with the Biddeford Climate Task Force through our Instagram at Biddeford Climate Task Force, Facebook page, and city webpage. These resources are also where you can hear about other events the task force will be a part of. Our public meetings